This session here is the Assessment and Adaptive Management session, and our first speaker is Asta from University of Tasmania. She'll present her own introduction and take you away.
Thanks for coming here after a busy evening last night and having energy still to listen to some talks. And I will talk about how we assess angling effort and the analysis we did about COVID effects on fishing, but also how we could extend it to also other questions about angling effort. And this is the work that I did in Lithuania. Even though I'm at University of Tasmania, I also have a part-time position at Nature Research Center in Lithuania. So I'm doing work in 2 different countries. We had a big project there on sustainable inland fisheries. So it's said that during COVID, we had this lockdown and we stopped human activity and nature had a chance to recover. The pandemic, still human activity, what does it mean for wildlife? Although when people started looking at it more carefully, they realized that actually there are both, humans were both threats and custodians of the natural sort of habitats of the environment. But actually, when it comes to fishing, a lot of you have probably heard anecdotes that the activity and human impacts on nature have probably increased during COVID, because what else is there to do? You can't go to work, so you go and fish. And when we talk to people, like how much has fishing increased, there are a lot of anecdotes that I went to my favorite fishing spot and there's like people everywhere. But how much is that? And we haven't actually assessed it. And it happened so that during the COVID pandemic, I was in Lithuania and we started studying this work. So Lithuania is a small country in Europe, not very far from Russia, so maybe that's how people know about it. But actually, it was mentioned yesterday in Ingrid's talk, and it was great to see it on the big screen, because Lithuania has a second highest participation of recreational angling in the world. So recreational fishing is hugely important in Lithuania. There are lots of lakes and rivers, and it's like everybody's doing that. 30%, I think, was the estimate of recreational participation of people fishing at least sometimes. And it's hugely popular, but if you ask managers how popular, nobody would actually be able to say. There are about 100,000 annual licenses being sold, but you can buy daily license, or some people don't need licenses, so nobody has any idea actually of how much recreational fishing happens. And when I ask managers who are supposed to manage recreational fishing, I ask how many angling trips do we expect per day? The answer is somewhere between 300 to 300,000. So it's sort of 1,000 times uncertainty, and we thought, what can we do about it? So we teamed up with the 2 companies, because we couldn't do surveys. There was no tradition to do any creel surveys, but we teamed up with these 2 really great Lithuanian startup companies. So DIPA is a Lithuanian startup, and they make these devices for anglers who they are very popular in Lithuania. Apparently 20% of anglers have these devices. You can use it for exploring the bottom of the lake, but you can also look for fish with that. And so we had a data sharing agreement, and so we could get anonymous data about where this device was used and at what time. And at the same time, to be able to calibrate this device usage with the actual real number of anglers, we collaborated with this company Trust, who are making these electric drones who are flying and counting anglers. So basically, we combined these 2 data sets together. We counted real anglers. We looked at how many people use the device. And then so this is, for example, 1 day of observations. We did this in one of the popular fishing destinations. Is 56 square kilometers, so this is a reasonably large area. And you can see anyway, this part actually, so the red dots are the sonar device users, and we try to calibrate it with the actually anglers counted by the drone. So this is ice fishing, so people are everywhere on water. In this part, it's the airport, so drones actually couldn't fly in this part of the water body. So this is just 1 day data set example, and we had a lot of these days where drones were counting and we were counting anglers. And we applied Bayesian methods, and we had a workshop yesterday discussing about what sort of methods could be useful for that. So the code for this analysis is available on GitHub. If you're interested to know how to do it, it's quite easy. It's in our code. I'm happy to share it. But basically, it's just a question for the given amount of real anglers, what's the probability of using that device? And we calculated that probability in the Bayesian approach. So you see the probability and the posterior distribution, that's the uncertainty. So during the open water, about 2% of people on average would be using the device with uncertainty ranges from 1.5 to 2.5. On the ice fishing, it's a lot more popular, so about 15% of people would actually be using the device at that given time. So we can scale the device users to the actual number of anglers. And this provided us, for the first time in Lithuania, a very accurate estimate of how many anglers we have, where, which day, every day, basically, because the data is extremely high resolution. Of course, a lot of issues. We still need to keep going and calibrating it better through time because the usage of the device might change. But actually, this question is slightly different. Then we extended it to 4 European countries, and we said, what is happening in Czech Republic, Germany, and Denmark? And we wanted to ask, how did COVID affect the angling effort? And so we had 4 years of data, starting from the beginning of 2018 to the end of 2021, daily data of that device usage in those 4 countries. Here we don't have calibration in Germany or Czech Republic, so we can't say related to the actual number of anglers, but we're interested in change through time. We can still say how things have changed. And so we need to apply statistical methods here. So basically what we wanted to know is in each municipality, in each country, how many users are using the device at that given day, and how that relates to the lockdown. So if during the lockdown more people were using the device in that municipality, the reason we split it by municipality is because we wanted to know whether, let's say, because people couldn't move during the COVID, and whether people in densely populated municipalities were more likely, let's say, to use it than in the other ones. And it's like a interaction effect, because we wanted to know, or we know that anglers fish more likely on weekends. There is more effort on weekends. We wanted to know whether actually during COVID, since we didn't have to work, whether more anglers fish during weekdays. So we had 5 lockdown phases in all of these 4 countries. They are slightly different, but basically we had pre-COVID long time. We had that much data from pre-COVID. Then there was first lockdown in 2020 in March when the COVID just started. Everybody was very scared. And then it was the summer of 2020 was relatively relaxed. Somehow there wasn't much. And then the true wave started. There was a long lockdown in 2021. I would like to remind you that we used a lot of random effects in here as well, because people say, oh, well, maybe the lockdown was during the autumn or bad time, bad season of the year, so that somehow affected. So the random effects here aim to account for that. So we account for season, we account for year, municipality, and other things. And from that, we try to extract what is the effect of lockdown. So what did we get? If we look at Lithuania and Czech Republic, what you see in here, this dashed line, shows the scaled fishing effort on the weekdays before the lockdown. Right. On weekends, we can see the red dot, the first graph. The red dot is actually higher, so the about twice higher effort on weekends compared to weekdays. But now COVID starts, and we can see, and we can see just how much the effort has increased. It's increased about, if this is 1, so it's increased almost 4 times, actually. On weekdays and also on the weekends it has increased. And also after the lockdown in the summer of 2020, it went down a little bit, but not too much. And actually all the way until the end of 2021, the effort didn't go back to the original values that we had before the lockdown. So people started fishing, they liked it, and they thought, that's great, I'm going to do it more. You know, and the same we find in Czech Republic, not as huge an increase, but still there was a reasonable increase. And you know, we are not talking about percentages here, we're talking about times. People say 10% increase in fishing is already having a big effect. We're talking about 200% increase in effort, in recreational effort here. So it sort of increased and it stayed approximately higher. In Germany, we saw slightly different. Again, it increased quite a lot, almost 2-3 times, but after the lockdown it seemed to have slowly went back to almost the original values that we had. Denmark had a slightly different situation, and we have a collaborator, co-author on this paper from Denmark. We saw a small increase, about 20%, let's say if we compare these weekday effects. And that's actually surprisingly similar to what they estimated independently from another app. They said it was 20%. But then we saw the decrease afterwards, and that's not what they see in their app, and I will discuss briefly why it is, because very few people in Denmark are actually using this device, and that might be a problem, that we actually don't have enough people using this device. So if we looked, actually what we found is that more people are fishing on weekdays. You can't see it from here because it's a bit hard to separate it. So now what we do, we scale both weekdays and weekends to 1. So now they are both scaled to 1, and you actually can see how relatively to this value, how the relative angling efficiency increased, effort increased during weekdays. Generally, consistently in each country, we find that during COVID, the relative effort increased during weekdays compared to weekends. Still, in total, more people fish on weekends, but the difference decreased small, and the same was in Lithuania. The difference was actually became even smaller, and in Denmark and in Czech Republic, the difference wasn't quite as big. So it's a bit hard to estimate, understand, so how much did the effort increase in total? But what we can do, we can count how many people, let's say, fished every day, with counting all the weekend and everything together, how many weekends we have, and just calculating number of, let's say, these angling trips that existed. So if we put it all together into one without separating weekend and weekdays, how many trips we had due to lockdown compared to what it would be if there was no lockdown and the effort stayed at the level that was before the lockdown. This is basically what we see. So we track, let's say, Lithuania, which is this red. So the effect of lockdown was 3.5 times increase in the effort. And it sort of went down and post-lockdown, but it still says 2.5 times higher than we had before the pandemic. And if we look at Germany, which is this green dots, again, it was about 2.5 times decrease when we combine all weekends effect and so on. And it sort of went down to almost the original levels, but only at the end of 2021. We had almost over a year of really huge increase in effort. In the Czech Republic, it also went down a little bit. The lockdown too had a small effect only, and then it went up again. As I said, Denmark decreased. But what is actually, so it's very cool to estimate COVID effect, but what's also amazing is that our statistician who helped with this analysis was saying, wow, this is amazing, because we actually have 70% of variance explained by these models. This is crazy high. Like, we normally can never explain that much variance using these models in ecological models. And it suggests us that the angling effort is actually quite predictable. If you account for day, season, municipality, you can predict quite well where people are going to be and how much of them are going to be there. So when we combine all of these fixed effects with the COVID effect, but also all the random effects, year, season, municipality, we actually can explain huge amounts of variation. So this is a super powerful management tool, potentially, to know how many anglers we have. And again, it relates to the number of users. Is that 15 minutes, or do I still have 1 minute left? Great. So the strength is a powerful method, can be used for diverse data. You don't have to use just the deeper data, for a lot of angling data. And the challenges, we need to calibrate it, and we also need to collaborate with companies. So for the calibration, our drone team has actually developed this machine learning method. So now the calibration is super quick. They just go and fly over the area, and automatically everything is identified, boats, anglers, people on the shore. In fact, and with the thermal camera, they can very quickly count the anglers. For collaboration, I would like to invite you to visit this workshop that we held together with private companies and so on about can citizen science smartphones and apps be used for recreational fisheries management. So it's on Sustainable Inland Fisheries YouTube channel. We had already over 400 views in here. And I think it's really interesting. People who were at the workshop yesterday, we will email you about it as well. And I'll just finish by thanking all my collaborators, a lot of them here, and the funding body. Thank you.
Brilliant talk, Asta.
Just to make it like laughter.
What? No, I think
Have
you
to be
need
in
to.
presenter mode.
I think if you have to not to be in this one actually, you have to be on the another, not in the slides,
You're trying to get to a different one?
not in
I'm
the
trying to
PowerPoint.
load the PowerPoint.
No.
Ah, let me get them.
I think if you get out of the PowerPoint, there is another screen that actually runs
Just click
them.
on these ones, open them,
Yeah, maybe just like that. Would
just
that
go the
work?
old school way.
Yep, here we go.
Alright,
We like to be difficult.
yep,
It's fine.
it's alright. Just
And then just the side clicker, I'm assuming. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's feeling a little bit fresher than I am today, so apologies for a bit of a raspy voice. My name is Shannon Burchert, and it's such a privilege to be up here today to talk to you about an aspect of my PhD research. Aside from being a PhD student with Edith Cowan University in Western Australia, I also work for the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, formerly known as Fisheries, in WA. And I just want to start off by acknowledging my supervisors from both ECU and the department. In particular, Karina Ryan has been a big part of this project. And today we're going to be looking at improved understanding of spatial patterns of marine recreational fisheries. Beautiful. So we know that fisheries is an ever-changing and dynamic valuable resource that contributes significantly to the economic well-being of the global population. In Western Australia alone, recreational fishing industry has been estimated to be around $2.4 billion. So effective management of such a valuable resource is so imperative for its long-term sustainability moving into the future. So some global issues that do saturate the views around this fishing industry that we're so embedded in are primarily based around overfishing. We also deal with, the changing climate and the challenges that comes with, such as mass mortalities and redistributions of fisheries beyond our management zones. So due to the past lack of expansive temporal recreational fishing data, we haven't really been fully able to explore our spatial patterns, and that's what I'm going to delve into a little bit today. So Western Australia has a very expansive coastline. It's 12,895 kilometres in length. That's not including islands, so there are quite a few islands off the coast. So it stretches from tropical warm waters all the way up in the north, down to blue waters in the south, a lot more temperate. So for this very reason, fisheries are actually managed based on these 4 diverse habitat regions. And majority of the recreational fishing in Western Australia, and we've heard a bit of it over the past few days, occurs in this West Coast bioregion, so this blue region in the south. And that's primarily because this is where our beautiful Perth, city of Perth lies. If you do get a chance, I would highly recommend visiting Western Australia. We do have great fishing over there. So because we have such a high population, it makes a very high priority for resource management. We do have a lot of resource users over there. So to get an understanding of the recreational fishes and what they contribute to the state, we run a statewide survey, and Karina will talk about that a little bit today. So in Western Australia, this survey actually goes into informing stock assessments, resource allocation between sectors, and the development and implementation of management plans. So what can we actually do? What can we actually do with this data to help inform management decisions? And that leads me to my first case study, which is looking at the demersal species, and a little bit later I'll talk about the pelagic species as well. So our aim is to develop an understanding of spatial patterns for some of our highly targeted species through time, and identify areas of high fishing activity and targeted effort. So the key species that I'm going to focus on today are the bulging grouper and the Western Australian jewfish. I do apologise, I think a lot of our talks have been on these 2 species, but it's for very good reason. So these two species, they're highly vulnerable to fishing activity. They are very sedentary species, so they are habitat dependent. They're also very susceptible to post-release mortality, which was also heard about over the last few days. So for these very reasons, they are also ideal candidates for spatial analysis. So I'm not going to talk about this too much, probably put a few people to sleep. But to examine shifts in the spatial patterns over time or location of activity, we're going to look at one kind of aspect of this spatial analysis, and that's spatial indices. So the spatial index that I'm going to talk about today is the centre of gravity. And the centre of gravity kind of represents the mean location of the population over a given area. So we have aggregated data. We've got 4 years of survey data between 2011 and 2018 that I'll be talking about today. So I'm also going to be talking about the probability of hotspots. So these are defined as areas where retained and released catch rates are above a cutoff value. So it'll be these blue circles here. So how can having an understanding of the spatial patterns of marine recreational fisheries, help to improve management? So it can help identify areas which experience high fishing activity, which areas are susceptible to high release rates, in turn where to implement management changes. So here we've got two maps. One's retained catch rate, which is on your right, left. And we've got release rates as well. So these are for both the Bulching and Groper, which are indicated by the red dot for their centre of gravity, and the WA jewfish are in black. So as I said, both species are endemic to WA, so their distribution does extend along our most populated of the coastline, which is our West Coast bioregion, which is this section of coastline here. You can see Perth just there. So Bulching and Groper are concentrated in the Midwest, which is a little bit kind of this area up here. And then our WA jewfish are across the entire West Coast. So you can see here their individual centres of gravity are actually influenced by their overall distribution along this coastline. So the blue-purple concentrated areas are the high catch rate areas. And these are what's pulling this centre of gravity in the north. So just between 2011-12 and 2013-14, you can see that there's been a contraction of fishing activity towards the coastline, along with a change in their centres of gravity. So for retained catch rates, you can see quite a big southerly shift. So this is fishers keeping more in the south, which is primarily driven by WA jewfish, which is compared to the released catch rates. So there is a consistent high patch, if you notice on the release map in the north, just off Geraldton. So just keep an eye on that as we move through the slides. So moving to 2015-16, the centre of gravity for each, the retained and the released catch rates are fairly similar to the previous year. However, one thing did change, and that's the magnitude of the catch rates. Yet we're still seeing this really high area in the north. So now on to 17-18, we're still seeing these high release rate areas, but we've also contracted a lot closer to the coastline, and release catch rates have somewhat increased. So knowing that we're experiencing these high release areas in the north, I was able to utilise catch rate data to produce probability maps of hotspots. So for Bulching and Groper, due to the spatial stability across the survey years, I was able to produce probability maps compared to the WA jewfish due to their spatial shifts, which was indicated by the centre of gravity. I was not able to definitively distinguish hotspot areas compared to their surrounding catch rate areas. So here we can see the areas just offshore Geraldton in the north are likely areas of release rate hotspots. So you can definitively see that the concentration that we saw from the previous slides are actually being picked up in the hotspot analysis. So why should we care about hotspots, and in particular, release rates? And if we don't know the answer to that by now, I'd be a little bit worried. So what we're doing is trying to reduce post-release mortality, because it's essentially adding to our sector's annual catch. And to do so, we need to put measures in place for areas that evidently experience high levels of activity. So with the advancements in technology, effort creep, as we like to say, fishers are able to effectively target and locate these species a lot more. These species that we're dealing with are very long-lived, they're slow-growing, so their stock recovery takes a lot longer compared to other species, so there is that extra added pressure. There are high associated release rates for these species due to current regulations such as bags and size limits, so that's another added pressure to the fishery. With high release rates, we have high post-release mortality. And one of the main causes of this post-release mortality is barotrauma. So it's evident from the hotspot maps that a management change needed to occur, whether it's a spatially targeted effort restrictions to manage areas with high release rates, or potentially a change in bag and size limits or seasonal closures, which is what we're seeing in Western Australia currently being brought in. So we know that we can apply these spatial measures to the management of demersal species, but we're also interested in looking at pelagic species and whether we can apply the same kind of concepts. So the pelagic species for this work are highly mobile and occur in adjoining states, so clearly they don't understand boundaries. And the main culprit that I'm talking about is an emerging recreational species, the Samson fish. They're not really ranked high on the menu, but they do give fishers a chance to go out and do sport fishing. So what we know that goes hand in hand with sport fishing is high release rates. So there are a few challenges with this fishery because of the nature of species. It's technically a moving fishery, so it's commonly associated with a catch and release behaviour. There are trophy fish. The Samson fish are considered a sport fish. They're high release rates, so they have, I think it's like 0.8 of catches are released. The estimated post-release mortality, you know, we are experiencing shark depredation with these species as well, so there is that added pressure to this fishery. But due to the highly mobile nature of the pelagic species, it can render some spatial closures ineffective. So yes, management approaches for this species are difficult on a spatial level. Evidently, hotspot analysis is kind of out of the question for this due to the spatial dispersal of catch data, and that's in comparison to our demersal species. So you can see that we do have areas of highly concentrated catch rates for these species, but they are very transitionary, so they are moving quite a lot. And you can see here also looking at the release rates as well. So I am exploring alternatives for looking at pelagic species spatial characteristics and drivers, but you will have to wait for my next paper. A lot of the work that I've been talking about for the demersal species is published in this top paper, and there's a QR code on the last slide if you do want to have further read. So on that note, I just want to acknowledge all the recreational fishers who voluntarily participated in our surveys, the department, and Edith Cowan University. Thank you.
We don't have enough time for questions now. We'll take some at the end of the panel session. That's it. I think I'm just doing the. Should be. Our next speaker is our local for the group, Justin Bell. Take us away.
Thank you very much. Just wait for a few people to get seated. Okay, so I'm going to talk about our progress on developing a harvest strategy for our snapper fishery here in Victoria. So the stock we're talking about is the Western Victorian snapper stock, we call it. It ranges from into South Australia through to about Wilson's Promontory. An important thing to note about the stock is about 80 to 90% of fish are spawned in Port Phillip Bay. So they spawn along the coast in various bays and inlets, but recruitment is primarily driven by Port Phillip Bay, which means we can really focus on Port Phillip Bay and the fishery in Port Phillip Bay, because it's literally what drives the future success of the stock. The other thing now, there's various agreements between Commonwealth fisheries and state fisheries, and about 80 to 90% of the catch is taken by recreational fishermen. So effectively, we have a stock that's based in Port Phillip Bay, the fisheries based in Port Phillip Bay, recruitment's based in Port Phillip Bay, and almost all of the fishing pressure on the stock is from recreational fishermen. So the future and the success of the stock is really based on our recreational fishery and how we manage that. And I guess I just want to show you a graph to try and explain why we're in this position. It actually looks quite good now, but a couple of years ago, various states have had some trouble. We've heard some talks from other states about their snapper fisheries. They haven't been travelling particularly well. A couple of years ago, we're doing okay in Victoria, but as you can see, other than that 2018 cohort, we'd had 6, even you can potentially look back, around 10 years of fairly low recruitment. So there was some possibility that we might end up in trouble in Victoria. Now we have another good year in 2022. Recruitment was very good. We're actually looking quite good into the future, but I guess it means we're not so much developing a harvest strategy now, we're more developing a co-management plan with recreational fishers and how we work with this fishery into the future. So I guess the focus has been on simplicity. We're relying on information from creel surveys, the recruitment monitoring. Sorry, the graph before I showed you was our recruitment surveys that we do. Our fantastic techie is in a room. Brent goes out and drives around with a little trawl net off the back of one of our boats, and we measure recruitment. And as you can see, it's very variable. So we're relying on information from our creel surveys, so what fishermen catch, our recruitment monitoring that we do, and developing real empirical monitoring based on data rather than a complex stock assessment model, even though we have one and we've used that to drive the process so that we can trust what we're doing. And so we've got a bunch of anglers who we're trying to we are engaging. They're driving this process as much as we are. And we're looking at performance measures like you would with any harvest strategy. So looking at catch per unit effort as a metric of biomass, and monitoring fishing effort satisfaction, fish size, harvest, and we also can develop some modelling to predict how things will progress into the future if we do go messing around with bag and size limits and things like that. So I guess this is the same as the graph you saw before. This is our recruitment, and this is how we forecast each cohort into time. We apply mortality. We can measure mortality quite easily. We do a lot of work looking at mortality on this stock. So this is how each cohort basically progresses through time. And once we know that, it actually allows us to to develop a forecasting process for the stock. They enter the fishery in Port Phillip Bay when they're about 6 to 7 years old. So given we've got that 6 to 7 year lag, we can actually predict what's going to happen in 6 to 7 years' time. So, for example, if we want to know what's happening in 2020, it's going to be based on the recruitment from 2013 and earlier and the aggregation of those cohorts through time. So the top graph here is what you get when you aggregate all of those cohorts that are in the fishery. The top graph on the left-hand side is our abundance index, and then we have our 7-year forecast based on what's going to happen with the adult stock into the 7 years into the future. And then the bottom graph is our observed recreational catch rate from our creel surveys. We interview thousands of anglers every year. There's a bit of sawtoothing going on, but it's quite a good indicator. As you can see from the top and the bottom, they match up pretty well. And what we can do is we can join those two data sets together. So rather than forecasting what the size of the stock is going to be in the future, we can actually forecast what the catch rate of recreational fishermen is going to be 7 years into the future. And we can then use that as a performance indicator of the fishery into the future. And so I guess, so we know how it's going to perform based on current mortality and how we can project how it's going to perform. But if we want to adjust that, if it's not going to meet some objective that we want from our fishery, given we have really good data on our from our creel surveys of what fishermen catch, the size composition, it's quite easy to predict what would happen if we went messing around with bag and size limits, because if they went out on a given day, if we had changed the bag and size limit, they would have had to have released X amount of fish. And the graph up the top shows you what I've ran it through the model, and I think I increased size limit by 5 centimetres and I decreased the number of fish. It's a bit of a complex slot bag limit, but so if I decreased the number of fish, big fish they could keep by 1, and I increased the size limit, you see the changed composition of the catch, and down the bottom that has reduced mortality, and it allows us to forecast how the fishery will perform into the future. So with that, even though it's looking okay, but if we did make that management change, you would see how the fishery would act into the future. That gives us the ability to predict what will happen if we go toying around with management arrangements. The other thing that we're interested in is angler satisfaction. We want everybody to be happy. So when we interview anglers in our creel surveys, we ask them how happy they are. And a standard way that most people have sort of looked at these performance indicators is up the top graph. You just look at how many people are happy, and that's a good way to look at it generally. But now when we're really delving into it, we're seeing it's affected by a whole heap of reasons. It's affected by how avid a fisherman is, where they fish, when they fish, the target species, even their postcode affects how happy they are when they go fishing. But the big driver is catch rate. It by itself is the most important driver, and it interacts with almost every other factor. So it becomes really complicated. And it's not just about fishing performance either. There's other things. So we had a commercial fishery buyout that made a whole heap of snapper fishermen really grumpy when that was going on, even though it wasn't really affecting the snapper fishery. So there's a lot going on, and just looking at angler satisfaction by itself could be unreliable. So how are we looking to incorporate it? Well, on the left, I guess, is a graph when you start looking. So this is a modelled probability of how happy people will be, broken down by avidity and where they fish and target species. And you can see it's variable by all those reasons I talked about. But if we really want to use angler satisfaction, what we need to do is we need to control for all the other factors that are influencing it. And down the bottom, what I've done is I've just pulled out the coefficient from the model that we're really interested in, which is, what is it? It's people targeting snapper and their catch per unit effort. So if we want to improve, and the effect it'll have on their satisfaction. So that's just a single effect of snapper catch per unit effort, and as the coefficient itself, 1.17. So if we increase the catch per unit effort of fishermen by 1 fish per angler hour, we'll get an increase of 1.17 in satisfaction. So that takes you, so on the graph, basically going from 0 to 5, very unhappy, very happy at 5. So we can get quite a notable change by just increasing a catch rate by 1 fish per hour. And so other things that we're sort of potentially looking at, fish size. So you can look at just the average size of the fish. That it can be useful. It does give you an indication of mortality and how the fishery is performing. But it's also, as you saw before with our recruitment, it's highly variable. So it's interesting, when you have a strong recruitment pulse, your average size goes down, even though your fishery's actually doing well, because you've got a huge year class entering the fishery, your size goes down, which makes it look like it's bad. So it's counterintuitive. The other thing, because we've got all the modelling I was talking about earlier, we can look at things like, so if we decrease, on the top right, so if we decrease mortality, say by 10% through bag and size limit changes, however we went about it, what this is showing you is the survivorship of a cohort under a reduced mortality. And effectively, if we reduce mortality by 10%, we can double the probability of catching a 10-year-old snapper, so a 4-5, a decent big snapper. On the left, you can see most of the average size is only 40 centimetres, which is when they're just entering the fishery. But if we did reduce mortality slightly, we could actually double the chance of catching a really good sized snapper. And that's not necessarily a sustainability thing. This is more about anglers, what they want from their fishery. They can play God with this stock now. It's their fishery, that's their stock. They can adjust things how they want and get the result that they want. And so the pretty standard indicators for a harvest strategy are things like effort. We've got a bunch of boat ramp cameras around the state now, dozens and dozens, and our colleagues at Better Boating are putting out more and more and more. So we sort of delve into that data and correct it for all the jet ski users and ramp watchers and things, and we can actually quite accurately estimate fishing effort at most boat ramps in Port Phillip Bay and through the state now. And the ones we can't, we're developing models with our aerial footage and satellite imagery to estimate the effort at ramps where we don't have boat ramp cameras. So we can get a really very, very accurate estimate of fishing effort throughout the state where this stock occurs. And so we've got our creel surveys, catch rates, we've got our fishing effort, so it's quite easy to estimate boat-based harvest. So when we get around to doing a total catch survey, then we'll be able to calibrate the boat-based catch. We'll be able to incorporate things like land-based and offshore where we don't have creel surveys. And that'll, once we calibrate it, we'll be able to quite accurately measure harvest into the future for a long time using our standard creel surveys and boat ramp cameras. So I guess where we're at and what we've learned, firstly, no one likes the term harvest strategy. It's not a good term for a recreational fishery. And as I said, we're probably more in a position now, it's probably more of a co-management arrangement. It's not necessarily measuring harvest. The stock's travelling well. We're more interested in what fishermen want from their fishery into the future. It's completely up to them. The sustainability isn't an issue now. For at least 10 years, we've got two really, really strong cohorts in the fishery, two of the best ever. The other thing we've learned that creel surveys are really, really useful. Like, we have a huge pool of data to drag on about angler behaviour and satisfaction and catch rate and where they fish and how they fish. And that enables us to develop all these models and predict what's going to happen if we do go toying around with management arrangements. There's also an interesting interplay between management objectives to meet your target biomass, if that's what we're mostly interested in, and satisfaction. That if we're mostly trying to manage the biomass of the stock for sustainability purposes, if we do go messing with it, we're going to inevitably upset anglers. No one wants us to go change their bag and size limits, but unfortunately, if we do that, if we have to do that, then we're going to be in a position where we make everyone grumpy. And how do you meet your satisfaction objectives when you're aiming for your biomass objectives? The two are intertwined in a really tricky way. But I guess it's early days, and we're slowly working through this process. Given we've had a couple of really good years of recruitment, we're not in a rush now. It's an ongoing work, and we'll continue to keep working on it into the future. That's all it from me, and thanks to all these great people.
Great talk. I think we've got time for one quick question.
Let me off thought.
Do you account for things like the weather conditions? Last snapper run, September, December was probably some of the poorer weather in especially afternoons that I remember.
Yeah.
Do you feel that has an effect on how many people then go fishing and what happens?
Oh, 100.
Go let it lie and does.
Yeah, 100%. We in our creel surveys and our boat ramp cameras, we're measuring how many people are fishing, and weather is, when we model that, weather is the #1 predictor. So wind direction and wind strength, it's more important than the time of year or anything else. Obviously, no one wants to be out in the bay when it's blowing 50 knots. So yeah, it's a big driver, definitely.
It's something that myself and other people at the club I'm in look back on and said that we didn't have a great season necessarily, or a lot of people didn't, but some part of that was the opportunity.
Absolutely, and that's the other thing to that is, I'm a snapper fisherman too, and it's so when you can only go fishing once, you might or might not find fish, but when you get a couple of weeks of weather and you get to spend a few days, you get to find where the fish are, then I go fishing every day because I know where the fish are, and my catch rate elevates, and yours would too. Once you've had a chance to really get stuck into them, when you just get the odd good day here or there, you don't get that opportunity to really nail it down. So it's a big factor, definitely.
Awesome. Thanks for that.
No worries. Thank you.
Cheers, Justin. Now we've got our next speaker, Matt Landos from New South Wales.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all today. I've got quite an interesting tale to tell, a strangely optimistic tale for me. Most of the stories I tell are deeply depressing and dark about the way in which we're destroying water quality. But this is a strange tale about the resilience of nature and its ability to deal with the filth of humanity. Okay, so we'll start off there. So I live up on the Richmond River in northern New South Wales. This is my beautiful river. It's hopeless. It's completely destroyed. It is one of the worst diffuse source pollution sites in our natural environment. A consequence solely and only of the behaviour of the people on the catchment and the policies of the government that support the behaviours and the activities on the catchment. It doesn't have to look like that. It didn't always look like that. We know that when the first settlers, colonial settlers, came to this area, there was abundant seagrass, which you can just spot it. He's about to throw the spear into. All of that seagrass is gone from the river. It's pretty hard to grow seagrass without light. And when your river's that turbid, no light, no seagrass, lots of other things, no as well. And when you're interested in fish, no's not what you want. You don't want no. Now, the river actually used to be called Place of Many Oysters. The name of our town, Ballina, was Bullina in Indigenous language, which was Place of Many Oysters. And that's where we should have lots of oysters. The name didn't come about by chance. This is an Indigenous midden that is less than 1 kilometre from my home, or it was. It's now less than 5 metres from my home. It's used as road base on my road. The midden was about 400 metres long and 20 metres wide, more than 5 metres high. It was carbon dated at the time. There's 1,750 years of continuous harvest in that midden. 17 tonnes of oysters were consumed a year. Every year, 17 tonnes of oysters were eaten, and next year there were 17 tonnes of oysters to eat again. We rocked up. It took us 30 years, and there were no oysters in the river. We harvested them out. We then started farming in the river because there were no oysters to harvest in the river from natural productivity. There's somewhat of a difference in values that took place between value of community, value of sharing versus personal acquisition. That shift in values that took place from Indigenous values to colonial values is central to the destruction of the landscape. But learning from that is also central to the restoration of the landscape. And one thing you'll notice is a bunch of people, and I'm proudly wearing an Ozfish shirt today, who are involved in reformulating community, back incorporating values that are about thinking about the community before you think about yourself. Not accumulating for yourself, giving back being more important than taking for yourself. Now, what we did was we thought we'd better convince the community of Ballina there was a problem with the oysters in the river. It wasn't apparent to them that the river was even sick. It was just brown, and after a while everyone's baseline shifts to brown as normal. Everyone's fishing baseline shifts to catching one flathead as a great day out. It's a crap day out. But it became normal because the river's productivity is declining. So we told that story to the locals through deploying oysters in oyster baskets and counting them as they died. That's one of my depressing stories. So we got Ozfish members to count the live and the dead. Every month we put the story in the paper, the living and the dead, and the story became quite clear that we can't even support a fouling organism in the Richmond River. Even Port Stephens Fisheries' best selectively bred oysters died in the Richmond River. They could not survive the environment they were living in. So things changed through time. So we had farming continuously up to 1970. About 1 million oysters a year were still able to be produced in this river with the activities on the river. Anybody who happened to see Cassie Price's talk about the Tuckian swamp and the drainage of wetlands and floodgating that took place along the east coast, that's what happened in 1970. It led to a dramatic change in water quality in the river, and at that point the oysters stopped being able to be produced in the river. So there was no way you could keep commercial oysters alive for 12 months of the year in the Richmond River after 1970. So we had zero production up until about 2015. And it's 2015 when I started trying to show with Ozfish members the story about what's happening to our river and the oysters, because we understood how important they were as filters. We understood how important they were for their spawning activity. There are a few things, I think, in the world more horny than an oyster. I mean, those things just love spawning. I mean, they are prolific spawners. And that is fish food. Like, there's no better nugget of food than eating an oyster gamete. That is like a nutrition bomb. And if you put that in front of larval fish, those larval fish are going to thrive on eating that food. If you have no food, the adage of if you don't eat, you don't shit, you don't shit, you die, is very true when it comes to fish. Particularly if you're a larvae, because you've got but days to eat before you run out of all the resource in your body and you perish. It's imperative food is there when you need it, and therefore it must be there all the time. This is what we have running into our river now out of the drainage. So this is very low pH water, deoxygenated water, water containing levels of heavy metals, and pesticides running off the landscape. That's the dark side. You'd think it remarkable that just here is our oyster line. So we put them in the line of fire and they died. But then a bit more of our catchments, as Cassie was talking about, is further up, another drained wetland, a massive plume of acid. The water running out here is more acidic than lemon juice at a megalitre a minute through a national park managed nature reserve that might be considered a marine protected area. You can see how ineffective land management can be if we do not manage for water quality, which is the ultimate arbiter of fisheries productivity. So we got anglers out and counted the dead in the landscape along the training walls in the river mouth, and this was 2015, and this was the moment when something important happened, and it was all to do with angler observations. They noticed that there were some living oysters on the rocks. And it was like, what are they doing there? That's weird. And they looked different. They didn't look the same as the old Sydney rock oyster. So we're like, is this a new oyster? This is confounding because the water quality at this point had not improved in the river. We haven't fixed barely any of the issues on the Richmond River. In fact, it's continuing to deteriorate due to poor management on the landscape. What we have is a situation of extreme evolutionary pressure being placed on an animal in an extremely adverse environment, and what appears to have popped out is a super oyster, a quite remarkable animal. It's changed its behaviour. This Besser brick wall here, all this spatfall on the wall is all alive, but before 2015 there was no spatfall on the wall. None. They didn't even settle and die. They weren't there. The new oyster is settling at a different height in the water column. It's colonising a different niche in the estuary. This is radical oyster behaviour, totally uncontrolled by us in the sense that we didn't engineer it to happen. We didn't do a breeding program to make it happen, but suddenly this oyster is now surviving, and some of these oysters are now 6 and 7 years old, and we actually have commercial size oysters. I'm not terribly sure about consuming them yet, given we haven't fixed Lismore's wastewater treatment plant yet, and the amount of shit running down the river means that they're inedible. Back to the bad news. But the good news is we took them and checked if they were heritable. Could we get this behaviour of survivorship to be heritable through breeding them in a hatchery? So we sent some adult animals down to Port Stephens hatchery. Fisheries were able to breed a small cohort for us. We put the spat back into the Richmond, and the little tackers survived. It was remarkable. And they survived through this window of disease that we see every year in summer, which is not a coincidence because summer brings heat and heat brings stress. And in oysters, we see this outbreak of a disease called QX disease, a parasitic disease of oysters. And what we see is that during the last few years, the outbreaks of this disease have been more severe across all of the estuaries where Sydney rock oysters are grown because of rain. Now, rain never used to be a bad thing. In fact, for fisheries, it used to bring productivity to the fishery. But now it brings humanity's filth to the fishery. It brings stormwater, agricultural runoff, and wastewater overflow, which contains all of our assorted chemistry. If I was on happy pills, they go out of me, down the wastewater plant, into the plant. If you're real lucky and got a real good tertiary plant, it might get trapped in the sludge. Mostly not, out into the river. The happy pills have effects on aquatic animals. Not necessarily good ones. They rarely benefit, though they might be depressed about the state of the water, but it's probably not helping them do what we want, which is to have a productive fishery. Now, so we sent these down, we got them spawned, we got them brought back. This is my son who came out and helped count, and they're growing. Now, we didn't know at the time, but the Fisheries Authority had also sent them to multiple other estuaries in New South Wales, some of these spat, and they survived there as well, even though selectively bred stock from Port Stephens were dying in the same locations. So these oysters have developed a superpower to survive. We've only just started looking at how this has evolved in terms of what changed in the oyster to make it survive. One of the things that appears to have changed is there's a particular enzyme pathway in oysters that's involved in their immune response, where they are able to upregulate their immune response. And some mollusks have been described to get multiple copies of the gene that allows them to have a supercharged immune response. So this is called the superoxide dismutase enzyme, so SDO for short, and this SOD, sorry, and these oysters have elevated gene expression of that particular gene compared to others. And we don't really understand the how or the why. All we know is that they're surviving, and we've now just bred about 40 million of them to deploy to the oyster industry through New South Wales in a hatchery. We're now getting oyster recovery on our rock walls that we haven't seen since 1970. It's quite remarkable. And it's been collaborations that the anglers have built, supporting university projects to try and take this further. And we are still very mindful that this quirk of nature has come out. I'm really glad it has, but at the same time, I'm deeply observant of the problems in my river that we need to fix, and many of them are up the catchment about loss of riparian veg, bad land use, poor agricultural management, and dreadful pesticide regulation. These are core to getting fisheries to recover, and there are no fisheries that are not affected by this. Thank you.
We'll leave questions for now and catch up in the panel session at the end for any questions for Matt. So our final speaker for the session is Chris from Tasmania. Take it away, Chris.
Thanks everyone for coming in. Something a bit different, trout fishing in Tasmania, an introduced species, and something that's been around for a long time in Tasmania. 159 years ago, early white settlers, in their endeavours over quite a long period of time, tried to introduce Atlantic salmon into Tasmania as a sports fishery, because there were no, or weren't seen to be any fish that were recreationally valuable in fresh water. So from my point of view, I'm not a scientist, but I like to develop techniques that are used to protect the fishery, promote the fishery, and also provide great trout stocks in Tasmania. And I think the key to this talk is to talk about wild. And in Tasmania, we've gone right away from hatcheries. We've got a really good, valuable resource with our trout fishery. So in a world where recreational fisheries are being put under pressure in Tasmania, at present we're very, very lucky in that we only have a small population of our own and a small population of anglers coming in. There are about 25,000 licensed anglers in Tasmania that fish in the fishery. Tasmania offers a diverse range of trout fisheries. Since the trout were introduced, they've modified their behaviour and been able to adapt to estuarine conditions, our freshwater lakes and streams, and have done very, very well. And hopefully through this talk I'm going to show you a little bit of the history of how the trout were introduced, but also a technique that we use to manage the fishery. So after many, many attempts, the early white settlers in Tasmania in 1864 were successful in bringing some Atlantic salmon over to Tasmania, and also some brown trout were put on as an addition, as an aside. The Atlantic salmon didn't do well, but the brown trout on the 4th of May in 1864 hatched, and that was the start of the brown trout fishery in Tasmania, but also the start of brown trout fishery on mainland Australia and also New Zealand, where we sent our over after that. In return, the Kiwis did send rainbow trout back a few years later, and we do have a good rainbow trout fishery, but this is about the wild brown trout. The endeavours of those early acclimatisation societies is now being seen with our wild brown trout fishery that's in place. Oop, wrong way. So these are the sort of fish that we see. Big brown trout, they're not all that big. That was one just to impress you. But there are definitely big trout in Tasmania. It attracts people from all over the world. In 2019, we had the World Fly Fishing Championships. It's been in Tasmania twice. So it's sort of recognised as a very, very valuable fishery. And here's one of the techniques that we use. So in the Central Highlands, we have a number of big hydro impoundments. And these impoundments offer us an opportunity in that most of them have an overabundance of fish. Most trout in Tasmania die of old age. They don't get caught by anglers. So we have these big impoundments and low fishing pressure, and what we've done is, in these strategic locations, we've been able to build fish traps. So these are fish traps that target the migrating fish when they're coming up the rivers to spawn. They're vulnerable to being caught, and we do it. So over here at King William, we've got on the Derwent River, headwaters of the Derwent River, we've built a trap. At Lyweenie, where our field station is in the Central Highlands, and a number of other ones around Arthur's Lake and the eastern side of the Great Lake as well. So these traps are pretty simple. So it's pretty much an inflowing stream that comes into one of these hydro impoundments. I think how do we get the whoop? Go back. Whoop. Sorry, I was trying to get the cursor to work. So anyway, stream flowing down that way, what the trap does, it enables you to be able to control the water even in heavy flows through a control gate up on the left-hand side here, down through the channel. The trout are typically running up from the lake and they will aggregate at the bottom of this weir. The weir is really important in its design. Typically trout can jump quite a high barrier, but by putting a low weir of only 1 metre and then putting an apron of about 6 metres of flat concrete, you'll see how that stops the fish from getting over. They can't jump because there's no pull, there's no capacity to jump over. And then we were able to direct them into the flow, into the channel. So you'll see here, this is a trap after it was constructed in 2016. In the water here, you can see the trout are starting to build up. See the masses of trout here before we've let a flow come through the trap. Big concrete precast panels. We just drop these into place. We've built a really good design over the years from some basic models that were built by the early fisheries officers at Wisniewski. We've developed to a point now where it's easy to use. We can bring trucks in to cart away large numbers of trout. The weir is positioned so it's about 200 mils higher than the intake gate, so even at the lowest flow, we can have the flows coming down the channel and still get the fish that are attracted to the bottom. And here's a little short video about what we do.
Lake King William is in the Central Highlands of Tasmania. It's a large lake in the Derwent catchment with multiple spawning streams that support a large population of brown trout. We trap one of these streams, the River Derwent, at the top of the lake, where we trap brown trout on their annual spawning migration. The fish are small in the lake due to the large population of trout, and their growth potential is limited. We weigh and measure them to gain knowledge about the fishery. We then use these wild adult fish, small but in prime condition, to transfer to popular waters such as the Brady's Chain of Lakes, which has more limited natural recruitment. The fish moved to the Brady's Chain then have the chance to grow, providing a great fishery resource. This is a win for the Brady's Chain and also a win for Lake King William by reducing the population of trout. For the Inland Fisheries Service, it's economical and sustainable.
So this is these are the brown trout as they aggregate at the bottom of the weir. This is some shots. And this is them trying to push onto the weir that they can't get over. So you can see here with that concrete pad, slight grade on it, only a metre high wall, doesn't have to be very big. The fish can't get over it. They can't get any jumping capacity there. They push back and they come up the side channel. In this case, the side channel is on this side. So this is what it gives us access to. It gives us access to thousands of wild brown trout from these overpopulated waters in the Central Highlands of Tasmania. What this has done in the last 10 years is enabled us to pretty much not use our fish hatchery at all. So typically we relied on the salmon ponds, and we spent a lot of money building a fish hatchery at New Norfolk, a research facility to grow fish. And what we found was those fish weren't doing as well in the wild as what these wild fish do. And because of the overabundance in these hydro impoundments and the lack of fishing pressure, as the video said, it's enabled us to be able to move these fish to waters that have got a lot more fishing pressure on them, to waters that haven't got good spawning potential, and we can control that. And I'll show you some numbers here. This is a typical year, a few waters that we've got around Tasmania. These traps are now providing us up to about 30,000 adult fish. I don't know what that equates to with stocking brown trout fry, but we're stocking millions of brown trout fry in the past and seeing very, very little result. What it also does is enables us to put adult brown trout into waters like where there are waters with redfin perch and other pest species that predate on them. The brown trout actually turn it the other way and they predate on the redfin perch, and they're a food supply. So this is a good way of managing that. It also allows us to, through our fisheries performance assessments on some of these smaller waters, to be able to tweak these numbers and actually push anglers to different waters. So an example of that is Arthur's Lake, one of the most popular trout fishing waters in Tasmania, a hydro empowerment. We're struggling post the drought. The fishery really battled. The water quality went bad. The anglers went away from it, and we were able to stock nearby Penstock Lagoon with 3,000 adult fish and push the trout fishermen to this lagoon. Even though it was small, we put the pressure on that water for a small period of time. That was supported by the trout guides. So you've got an industry there where the trout guides are keen to keep their anglers fishing and catching fish. So by moving these fish to Penstock Lagoon for a few years, that provided a resource for them. We're now backing off on that. Arthur's Lake's now recovering, and anglers are catching lots and lots of fish there with the rain over the last 3 years. So we can tweak this all the time. We do fisheries performance assessments to enable us to have good knowledge through our creel censuses as well, to work out where to best place these fish. So from a recreational angling point of view, if you haven't been to Tasmania and been trout fishing, it provides a diverse range of opportunities for trout fishing, but also an environment where trout are now in nature with a lot of the native species there. A guy called Devon Olsen from Team USA, who came to the World Fly Fishing Championship, he said it was like fishing in a zoo. The number of native animals you see around while you're fishing, he was just so impressed, and I think all of the international anglers were as well, despite the fact that we had the first week of December, we picked a week where we thought it was going to be the best trout fishing, and we had a week of snow and horizontal wind, so it blew them away, but they still enjoyed it. So if I've got a minute or two, I've just got a quick little video to run here about a bit of an interaction of a brown trout with one of our native animals. You have to wait a little bit, it goes on, but... Ooh, maybe I haven't.
Should be able to get it up.
Should just play, shouldn't it? No. It's sitting there. It was. Here it is. This is a sea-run brown trout feeding on whitebait in one of our estuaries. And there's the trout with him, both feeding on the whitebait. So I guess if I can reflect on one thing, is those early white settlers that brought the brown trout out to provide us a freshwater recreational fisheries in Tasmania, they did one good thing, in that early on they imposed a £1 licence. And at the time that was designed to actually keep the average person from fishing. It was too much for the average person to fish. But that licence is still in place today. It's $79.50 to fish for 12 months in Tasmania in freshwater. We have our own individual freshwater licence, and the Inland Fisheries Service is still separate from our Sea Fisheries Department, based on that early work that those acclimatisation societies did. So, thank you.
great place to finish with a video like that. If I can have all the speakers head up to the front and we'll do a quick question and answer session.
If anyone's interested in the origin of the trout fish, I've got a few of these books here if you want one. I've got some more there.
So any questions? Hands up for...
So, Chris, with trout being introduced in Tassie and great videos of trout and platypus eating the same food, have many studies been done as to how they might impact native species and food for those species?
Yeah, we have a range of native species in Tasmania, mainly galaxids, and there's some of those that are threatened, I think, like the mainland Australia, mainly due to climate change, but also probably to do with trout in places as well. What we've lost, we don't know from the early days. But we've got a management strategy for most of those species. And the other thing that we do is we don't move trout to any waters that don't already have trout in them. And we have a vast area of wilderness. Unfortunately, a few of the native species are on the east coast of Tasmania, not in heritage areas or in national park, so they're being affected more by drought than the trout. But yeah, part of our charter is not to move trout to any of those waters now, and 40% of Tasmania is in either national park or reserve.
Thank you. Justin, my question's for you, and it's a little bit three-pronged, but they're easy ones. Look, do we understand what drives those variations in the recruitment to the snapper fishery? And then on from that, I realise that, or I understand that in the sampling, the baby snapper don't sort of turn up before they're about 50 cent piece size. Do we understand, a bit about where those fish are before they're, that size, more in their larval stages? And the last part of that question is, are you factoring their habitat and their early life cycle into your planning and your strategy for the fishery?
Good questions. I don't know whether I need it. I've got a loud voice. Yeah, so the drivers we know quite well. Former colleague Paul Hamer did a lot of work on it for his PhD. So it's effectively environmentally driven nutrient inputs into Port Phillip Bay and the plankton cycle. So when it's successful, you have a classical sort of diatom to copepod, traditional planktonic cycle. And when that all formulates at the right time of year, when the snapper spawn, we tend to get really good recruitment. So it's usually high river inputs, so good rain, like La Nina weather patterns are really a big driver. So the drought years was when we had quite poor recruitment. And so the second part of that, I guess we sample the babies when they're about 50 cent piece because that's when it's easy to catch. They don't have a long larval phase, so they're only in the planktonic cycle for days. So there'll be lots of little snapper out there somewhere, but it's not easy for us to sample them. So we time our sampling once they've settled and they're at a size where we can catch them easily, and that's in March each year. Habitat-wise, I personally don't know a lot about the demands of tiny little snapper. Paul probably would better than me, to be honest. But it seems once the stage where they have trouble is when they're a larva. So once they've settled through that phase, if they get the food they need when they're a larva, then our predictions are very, very hugely accurate. So yeah, the critical stage is that planktonic stage. Did I get there with all three?
I think so. Are you planning habitat into your strategies, particularly in those early phases?
We're not planning, but certainly some of the work that's being done, the oyster reefs in Port Phillip Bay, they're all going to be great, I imagine. They'll help improve. So that's not work I've been involved in. Paul was in the Nature Conservancy. That's brilliant. That's only going to make things better.
Get those numbers up.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think so. But yeah, they certainly they do. They're abundant in seagrass as well, and seagrass is doing really well in Port Phillip Bay at the moment as well.
Asta?
Can
I ask a question from Shannon. So it was quite astounding to see that the post-release mortality is so high for some of these species, and I wonder, so one, I guess, how it is accounted, whether anglers know it, because a lot of people think, okay, I just released it, it's all fine. But also with increasing fishing effort, what are the plans to do it, and whether should it not even be caught if it's like, I don't know, I'm just throwing out a very controversial question, but if we know that the mortality is so high, should we not actually allow pulling them out from a certain depth, deeper than certain number of meters?
Yeah, and I guess that's why a lot of the regulation changes are coming into Western Australia, is to, reduce that post-release mortality. A lot of the publications that fisheries do, like all the reports that come out, we do try and put it out there to fishers that have an understanding about post-release mortality. And, these key species that we do have are really highly susceptible. We also, like part of our education program, it's run through that. We do promote a lot of our release weight stuff for the demersal species, especially in the West Coast bioregion that I spoke about, because it is an issue around there. So we do a lot of promotion around that, yeah.
I've actually got a question for Asta. So for those that weren't here at the start of the session, Asta gave a great talk where she was looking at trying to identify recreational fishing effort through some new technologies like drones, and for me there was the sonar device you were looking at. One of the questions is, did that have like the company register like a GPS location, and that's how you're able to do it? And do you think something similar to that could be applicable to smartphones and extending that to basically a broader coverage?
Yes, exactly. So I could have talked for another 15 minutes, like time flies very quickly, but I just wanted to say that I think even though that specific device maybe it's not available well, it is available in Australia too, but I actually think that anything that would have angling activity associated with the GPS and time could be used for that, and so application for this is huge. So even social media posts, or I don't know, lots of things that we could try to actually calibrate that activity with some external analysis of angling effort. So yes, I think that is a huge potential, and we had a workshop about it yesterday. So yeah, if anyone is interested, let me know.
Is that facilitated through the company that provides those sort of GPS devices, or? Well,
so to get the data, yes, we had a data collaboration agreement with the company. You wouldn't be able just to download it for free. You need to enter into this course. So you agree how are you going to treat this data, anonymous and so on. And yes, so, but we are talking about possibilities of, maybe after some time the data could be available more widely, and yeah, so it's not clear.
Just a question for Maddie. Great talk on the oysters. I was just curious around that strain from a commercial perspective, and what next? Is there sort of a thought around going into putting them into the mix of commercial production across the coastline?
Yeah, so the oyster industry, the Sydney rock oyster industry, is fair to say it's on its knees. In fact, it's probably lying down actually at this point. We're further down than knees. So many of the major production estuaries have been lost from production. So it's not just the Richmond River that's gone. Clarence River's gone. It's not in production at all. Big chunks of the Macleay no longer operate. The Hawkesbury's severely impacted. Georges River's impacted. So where the Bellinger and the Kalang River's gone. So we've lost a whole number of what were active oyster leases that spanned the same 100 years of operation time frame that are no longer actively producing. Those oyster farmers who still maintain active lease are crying out for spat. And so we've been able to supply the hatcheries with brood stock that Ozfish has collected from the Richmond, and they're now going out to those commercial farms to try and get them to be able to grow something. And that's having benefits back to those estuaries in terms of the filtration capacity in those estuaries. So oyster farming really is one activity that is quite positive in its contribution to the health of waterways. In areas like Moreton Bay, where we have a huge area actually of oyster lease, more than 95, actually probably up around 98% of the lease now has no oysters being farmed on it because you can't keep them alive. So this is a very clear statement about the water quality in that receiving area that's impacting the health of those molluscs. And it's also impacting the health of everything else, the other fish. So just to the north of Moreton, we have the Bribie Island Aquaculture Centre, which runs an aquaculture program, breeding all manner of fish, but we've bred cobia there. And during Cyclone Yasi, we bred cobia that couldn't decide if they were boys or girls. So 17% of the cobia we bred had eggs growing in the testicles of the male fish. So these are intersex fish that are produced due to the pollution plume that came out with the rainfall. Now, we just saw that because we had eggs developing at the time when that critical exposure happened, and we were able to kind of observe it in real time in tank-held fish. But of course, these exact same exposures were happening to our wild recruitment, and they're having serious impacts on the viability of recruitment. If you've got half testicle, half ovary, it's not that useful for trying to get lots of progeny out. So there's some really profound things happening in water, and oysters are part of the kind of canary, I guess, that are telling us that many of our waters are not as clean as Robson is hoping. And I know that's a little bit gloomy, but it's also the huge challenge, I think, for anglers to recognise that if they want to have a future future recreational fishery, let alone a commercial one, they're going to have to get involved in water quality improvement because the trajectory is negative.
Might take one more question if we've got one.
Matt, just for you and following on from the Richmond oyster and its commercial purposes, what's next for the oyster and the chapter in the Richmond River, and what are they planning to do there next?
So we're butting up against the Environment Department and a whole bunch of departments trying to get oyster reefs back in the river. So we're now trying to deploy material that will allow these oysters to begin recruiting back to areas. You'll see on those images I had up that there was only the intertidal oysters that were recruiting. So there's only a certain elevation in the estuary that is available for this oyster to land on. We want to create areas in the estuary for it to land on. But that's a bigger crime than pouring thousands of tons of topsoil out the estuary, which is apparently okay. So we're having great trouble, but we will, I can tell you, through the power of persistence, we will get oyster reef recovery happening in the estuary. There's a range of areas that we know if you dig down, you actually just have to dig off the top metre of mud and you'll find oysters, and then there's metres of shell buried underneath the mud. It's the same in right throughout Moreton Bay. After the recent rainfall, we saw the mud plume extend massively out into the bay, just covering up really productive fish habitat with a much less productive fish habitat. So, but that's what we're doing. We're going to be widening the scope of finding areas where we can deploy some infrastructure at the right height that we know will get catch on. We're not going to try and facilitate that catch. We think most of the catch will come naturally as soon as we put material at the right height that's clean material that the spat can settle on. We'll get that recovery happening, and we think that's going to do quite a bit. Certainly I hope my flathead fishing improves.
Can we thank all of our speakers? Thank you very much.